In this episode, I'll be tidying up the brake lines and clutch line. I'll be revisiting how the engine is mounted. I have a solution there for making sure that the engine is mounted properly, and working on all the steps necessary to get the engine started. Okay, I've mounted some of the brake components. As you can see here, I put a connector onto this hard line with an adapter to the 3AN, which then goes to the brake bias connector. So this is the rear brakes. From the master cylinder, I've got a hose going to a splitter that splits completely to the front set of brakes, again with an adapter, and from here it will go to the brake bias adjuster. There's some connectors I still need to install. Similarly, I have to install the clutch line from this master cylinder to the slave cylinder over here. The brake bias control, I've actually mounted it on the firewall so that the handle is actually inside the car. So if you look carefully under there, you'll see the red handle. It's out of the way, but should I ever need to, I could have changed the brake bias while in the car. Here you can see all the brake lines connected up, as well as the clutch line being connected. It's a little untidy. I might try and find shorter hoses, and also perhaps put in one or two hard lines, especially between the brake bias and the splitter valve there at the bottom. You'll see that it's an S shape. Other than that, it's all connected up, so it should function. What we are looking at here is the starter motor, and the starter motor attaches to the bell housing. The bell housing, as you can see, is actually touching one of the chassis pipes. Now that is a problem. It can't touch, because any deflection in the engine as it moves will cause that bar to deflect and probably damage it. Now there are two options. One is that I could raise the engine by, say, 1/4 of an inch, and perhaps the transmission as well, or I could just cut this bell housing out a fraction. Now, obviously cutting the bell housing is not a wonderful option. It's destructive, but it will give me the space I need. Let's just see what that means. Raising the engine will probably most easily be done here by adding a spacer to the bottom of the engine mount. You can see the rubber isolator there, and similarly on the other side of the engine. But we have to make sure we have room. And just as you can see, here are the headers. And you see that the top of the header is actually very close to that chassis tube as well. So it really limits the amount of how much I can raise the engine at all. In fact, I think this is a non-starter. I'm not sure if I can raise the gearbox a fraction. As we can see, we have a mount here. It probably is fairly easy to add spacers here just to raise it a bit. But whether we can raise it enough, we will have to see. Okay, I've now put a jack underneath the gearbox. I've loosened the gearbox mount there, and just raised the gearbox by a fraction. And what I'm seeing is that we now have just enough room on top of the chassis tube, between the chassis tube and the bell housing, the starter motor housing. Okay, we've got just enough room between the chassis tube and also the cutout for the headers. So I think that is the viable solution. Okay, I've just completed adding the catch can connections from the dry sump container to the catch can, and from the cam covers also back to the catch can. You can see it ended up being rather tidy. Okay, the first thing I want to do is to make sure that the oiling system is pushing enough oil through the engine. So what I've done, I've disconnected the oil pressure sensor and put a little jar there to collect the oil. I'm going to remove the spark plugs. They're loose at the moment, so I'll just pull them out, and then I'll turn over the engine and see if I'm getting a reasonable oil flow out into the little bottle. What you see is that there is oil in the bottom of the jar, so we are pumping oil around. What you're seeing here is the distributor. You can see it's buried in under the engine, above the scavenge pump and below the carburetors. At the moment, it doesn't appear that we've got any spark. So I think the first thing to check is to take the coil wire off and to see whether the coil is actually producing anything. Also, I'd like to inspect the points. So now we're just going to test the spark coming out of the coil. So I've put a spark plug in the coil wire, which means that it will fire 4 times as often as a spark plug normally would. But we should see a spark going between the gap. You can see that the body of the spark plug is resting against the cam cover, which is earth, and I've got the coil wire into the end. As you can see, there was no spark, so we just need to check the wiring on the coil first. The first thing I need to check is to see whether the coil is actually getting 12 volts. So the ignition is on, and this is the plus side of the coil, and we are seeing that we're getting 13.16 volts, which is great. Okay, we're looking at the top of the engine. You see the carburetors and the cam cover. If we go down between the two, you'll see the distributor there, and you'll see that we don't have any distributor points at all. It looks like it's an opto system. The issue I have is that I don't have the associated circuitry to use this instead of just normal points. So that's something I need to research and about how to replace. With the distributor seemingly not working, I just want to test the coil. So what I've done, I've just got a ground wire going to the bottom of the coil, and I'll just act as if I were the distributor points. So by just shorting out to ground, we can see that there is a spark on the plug there. There we go. So the coil looks fine. After some research, I found out that the points are a Petronics unit. It's a Hall effect sensor, and I found the wiring, and I discovered that I had wired it incorrectly into the coil. So let's just see if we can crank the motor and see if we see any spark. Okay, it looks like we've got spark, which means the next thing is fuel. The next step in getting the car running is to see whether we've got any fuel pressure. As you can see down there, we've got a fuel pressure gauge. So what I'm planning to do now is to put some fuel into the car and get the pump working and see whether we've got fuel pressure and how much fuel pressure we have. I obviously need a different funnel. The next thing to do is to put in the fuel pump relay. It's there. And then go and put the ignition on. We can hear the fuel pump. We're not seeing any fuel pressure yet. Oh yes, there we go. We're up to 3 psi, which is about right for carburetor, and you can hear, was it 3 up to 5? Maybe I have to turn the regulator down a little bit, but that should be enough to get the car started. So we have. This is the moment of truth. Will the car actually start? It kicked over, it kicked over. Okay, let's add some throttle.